So this is one of those things that comes up when you start talking about charter schools and private schools, is when you are thinking of things like special education. That's not something that necessarily has to, that charter schools or private schools have to provide, but public education is for every student in America, and as such, they have to kind of provide all of the services that go along with that. So charter schools are actually public schools because they receive public money. They are independent from school districts though, so they don't, they're not held accountable by the school boards. They have a contract that goes with the state of Texas, and that's what's called the charter. So technically they are held to standards through that contract and what's in that charter, but there is no sort of supervising authority looking after, you know, the teachers teaching the school, or the way in which the material is taught, or if they're following the curriculum set by the state of Texas. So because charter schools are a type of public school, they don't charge tuition. They do receive funding from the state of Texas. And so charter schools are competing with public schools for the same sort of pool of money that exists out there for education in the state of Texas. Private schools, obviously they charge tuition. They don't receive any sort of public funding. A lot of the times it's through donations. They're private organizations that will help kind of with the facilities of the school. And this can include religious or moral instruction. They're not held to the same standards as public schools. And then school vouchers. So these are using public money. So the state of Texas actually doesn't have a public voucher program. There are something like 14 states in the United States that do have voucher programs in which public money is allocated to a select few students. It's not, you know, it's a very small portion of students who receive these and who choose to receive these, but it would cover partial to full tuition at a private school. But again, with that, there are a lot of caveats. The private school does not have to accept the tuition waiver a lot of the time. And for a good portion of the time, it's not full tuition. So families do have to find different ways to be able to still afford private school. They actually also do things like tax credit scholarships. So if a organization decides to pay the amount of tuition for a student, the state of Texas would basically, or not the state of Texas, but any state that does this would compensate that organization in full. So it works basically the same as a school voucher, but the organization would get a tax credit for that same amount. So I guess just some of the stakeholders in this. You've got teachers, you've got parents, you've got students, you've got teachers unions, you've got school administration staff. There are a lot of different people who are involved with the debate on school choice. I've put a lot of information under teachers because there's, I think, a pretty good argument made for either side of it, that obviously teachers are kind of the most important part of delivering education because they are the person that's in front of the student and can, I think, impact the student so immensely, whether or not the material is good. Though, I mean, I think most people, and I'm sure most people here can say that they've had a teacher who's just changed the way they think about a subject, whether or not they like the subject going into it. So for working in a public school, teachers are required to be certified. They aren't required to be certified for charter schools or even in public schools. And being certified means things like they have to have graduated college, they have to have a degree in the subject in which they're teaching, or if they don't have that, they have to show that they pass an exam of sorts to be able to say that they're competent to teach that subject. And if they do follow through with this probationary period, they are offered teacher tenure. So I actually never heard of teacher tenure before last year, but it's basically this idea of, I'd heard of teacher tenure in terms of like universities and professors, and professors who work really hard and then they get tenure, which basically means you can't fire them. But that this is a concept that's very prevalent in public schools, because if teachers go through this probationary period, they get teacher tenure and it becomes very difficult to fire a teacher. that if a teacher is deemed to be just really not good at their job, that they've been evaluated and they, the way in which they're teaching is just not effective anymore, they are required to be put on a sort of remediation plan. And it's with another teacher who can be there to kind of guide them, right? So these are all good steps to take to make sure that the teacher is having the best impact that they can have on the student. But it gets to the point where, then if the remediation plan doesn't work, they're put on a probationary contract, right? And this can go up to a year, in which they're evaluated more closely to see if they've kind of changed the way that they teach their class, or they've kind of made improvements. And even if they don't do that within the year, then at that point, the school district can decide not to renew their contract. But the teacher is still allowed to sue the school district if they feel that they were unrightfully fired from their job. So I think there was actually a case in the last 2 years with a teacher at Houston ISD, and she's part of the union of the Houston Federation of Teachers, I think. And she had kind of been through this whole process, been put on this probationary contract, and they decided not to renew her contract. And she threatened to sue, and the HISD said, okay, we're going to let you stay for another year if you don't sue. And it kind of gets to the point where, it's a very lengthy process to be able to remove a teacher who's deemed to be ineffective in the classroom. And you kind of have to see both sides of it, right? Because the whole idea behind that is to protect the teachers, right? Because sometimes there are administration issues in which maybe there is a member of administration who feels biased towards certain teachers, and they shouldn't have this sort of unlimited power. But at the same time, for the benefit of the students, that if a teacher is consistently being very poor, I mean, I've had teachers who have just been really quite poor, and I feel like there should be some sort of way in which we can evaluate them in a way that benefits the students first and foremost. So obviously the parents are also stakeholders. They want the best for their kid. Oftentimes for charter schools, they require parent involvement. And this can be an obstacle for some parents because a lot of parents don't have the time. Some parents are working 2 jobs to be able to support their kids, and they don't have the time to go to PTA meetings and that sort of thing. But charter schools can impose requirements like this. It's not uncommon for them to do so. They do it with the idea that if the parents are involved in the student's education, that the student will fare better in the classroom. So I guess there's that. Obviously, the students are stakeholders. We want for them to have the best sort of student outcomes that they can have. Teachers unions as well, right? So kind of what I mentioned with teacher tenure and with these contracts, teachers unions have a lot of sway with the way that these contracts are negotiated with school districts to ensure that teachers can be protected, but also so that if a teacher is going to be fired, teachers unions will they will come out in force, and they will be very vocal in their admonishment of that school district. So these are kind of the main conflicts. I'm going to come back to these at the end of just things that are just conflicts in discussing the different types of schools that are out there. Efficient investment of funds, of where can the state of Texas kind of best devote their resources to be able to produce improve student outcomes. Are public schools better? Are charter schools better for more bang for your buck? Accountability. So charter schools, because they have that lack of accountability, it just depends on how you look at it, that a lack of accountability could lead to potentially charter schools that aren't doing what they should be for the students because there's nobody to oversee them. But at the same time, not having to go through more of like a bureaucratic process as it comes to dealing with, contracts of teachers and that sort of thing, and being able to directly hire and evaluate teachers could open the door for more innovative solutions. And then when it comes to choice, so I was mentioning that, I went to a public school it's in one of the, I think it's one of the higher property tax areas in the state of Texas. And as such, there's a lot of money that's then filtered back into the school district. And even if I didn't grow up there, I know that my parents and a lot of my friends' parents have the means to be able to go and buy a house somewhere else, right? That if you can go and buy a house in an area where you feel that the school district is best, then you have the right to do so. But if families can't afford to do that, should that prevent them from being able to have the choice to say, where should I send my kid to school? For priority, so this is interesting and not something that I'd ever thought about, but so if a school is consistently failing, right, that there have been consistent markers that, there are obviously different metrics when you have students taking STAR testing and that sort of thing. But if you have students who consistently are failing in that school over a period of years, right, at what point do you say that the school should be closed and that we should start again? Because obviously the student outcomes are important. There are also jobs at stake there, because you have not only the jobs of the teachers, you have the jobs of the school nurse, the principals, the janitors, everybody who works in that school suddenly would be out of a job. So that kind of becomes a question of priority. And then also process. So when I mean leadership of a school, I'm kind of talking about having school boards. So for charter schools, right, you don't have to have a school board looking over and being accountable for that charter school. So should the focus be on upholding democratic norms, right? So should we be focused on schools in which we elect the school board? We elect people who will kind of distribute the money, who will look to see how student outcomes are improving? Or should the focus just be on being creative in the way that we tackle improving student outcomes for as many students as we can in the interim? So this is just some kind of general information about Texas education. So in 2018, about $50 billion in state and local money went to about 5 million students in around 1,000 traditional school districts and 170 charter districts. So the vast majority of students in the state of Texas go to public school. The K through 12 spending has gone up in the last 10 years, but we actually haven't really increased the amount of money that we're spending per student. I think as of 2020, Texas ranks 34th in the country. So for the amount of money that we are spending, we're certainly not kind of improving our outcomes. We're not even at 50% of the United States, so that's great. So school funding kind of comes from two sources. That it comes from local property taxes and also state funding. So that's something that's been in play since the 1940s. And with that, over time, the property tax rates have gone up as more people kind of buy homes and as more people want to live in particular districts and particular areas in Texas. So as those property tax rates go up, the share of money that taxpayers are paying for education has also gone up. So I think I read somewhere that it said taxpayers are now paying 67% of that share of money that goes towards education, with the state of Texas only having to pay, 33%. So in 1993, the Texas Senate passed a bill called Senate Bill 7, right? And it had three parts that kind of changed the way that school funding was implemented in Texas. So it had 2 tiers and then a recapture program. And this is kind of called, and by some people, the Robin Hood program. The first tier is about guaranteed funding from the state for schools that have at least a minimum property tax rate. So most school districts get this amount of funding, right? The second tier is for school districts who levy more than the minimum property tax rate, and the state will give them a certain amount of funding for that, right? And then you have recapture, which is that if property tax rates go above a certain amount per student, then the excess money would be redirected to property poor school districts. So this is kind of the way that Texas has chosen to tackle educational inequality that is derived from school districts that don't have high property tax rates, and being able to kind of redirect money towards those school districts so that they can continue to improve their educational outcomes. So in doing some of this research, I also looked at superintendents of HISD. I looked at Rod Page, who had been, I think, kind of valued very highly for the work that he did while he was superintendent. He was superintendent for 7 years in HISD. And also I looked at Dr. Terry Greer, who was superintendent of HISD very recently from 2009 to 2016. So for Rod Page, his approach was really interesting of how to kind of deal with things like educational inequality between schools and things like having more accountability. And his view was to take this sort of holistic approach, that it wasn't, you know, let's just focus on public schools and let's just kind of throw money at the problem. His view was to kind of look at what was working in charter schools. Is that stuff that we can then incorporate into the way that we deliver education at HISD? So he hired people who knew what they were doing in different areas, from transportation and food service, so that the Board of Education was just focused on their only task was education. He decentralized management so that principals could make their own hiring decisions about the staff that they hired, and their only condition was that it had to be in team, so it wasn't just one person making the decisions unilaterally. And so superintendents, principals, and then people in administration, not the teachers, but at least those in administrations, were put on contracts that were dependent on performance and not tenure. So this is kind of the way that, you know, most jobs out there work. That's not really how education has worked in the past, but this was, I think, Superintendent Page kind of taking that step, not yet making this true for teachers in HISD, but at least for administration, that you have to perform to be able to make more money. He also introduced choice for parents and encouraged HISD to create 20 charter schools in that area to see if maybe charter schools could open up new avenues through which, you know, education could be delivered, right? Because the idea behind charter schools was that they could be these experimental sort of projects, right? That if you open a charter school, you're not held accountable to the same standards as a public school. So you can make the school day longer. You can introduce different activities during the day to keep students engaged. There's just a lot more that you can do with it. And so I think that's part of this idea of opening 20 as a trial program to see where it could go. I mean, he gave more funds per student in schools. He kind of spoke with the community to figure out how to increase the budget for HISD so that he could give more money to schools. And then during his time as superintendent, the amount of students who passed the Texas Assessment of Academic Skills went up drastically, including low-income students, which increased from 58% to 71%, showing that at least some of the things he did were working. And I think, funnily enough, he left HISD after 7 years and went on to become Secretary of Education under George W. Bush. And he was actually the architect of the No Child Left Behind policy. So maybe it doesn't quite work on a national scale, but in the scale of at least looking at HISD, there were some things that really did work. So also through this process, I spoke with Ms. Villanueva. I don't know if maybe some people have heard of her before. She's spoken to Bonner in the past. She works for the Center for Public Policy Priorities, kind of focusing on education in Texas and I spoke with her on the phone a little while ago, and she honestly has just this grasp of the way that funding for education works in the state of Texas. That's she just kind of distills it down into something that's very digestible. But she is a big proponent of public education. She believes that school funding is the major cause of inequality in schools in Texas, but she does see that recapture, or what was known as Robin Hood, is doing its job in redistributing state funding. So there's at least that's working. She did think that the state of Texas needs to spend more on public education, right? So there's kind of that idea of if we just throw money at a problem, will it really solve it, right? Is there a need for creative solutions? But she quoted this, and there is some research that backs this up, that if you do spend $1,000 more on each academically disadvantaged student in a school district, that student outcomes improve dramatically. So there is something to be said for spending more money on education, that it's not just, a pit that you just keep throwing money at. She also mentioned some interesting alternative options for how school funding can be financed. She mentioned a split roll property tax. So this is the first time I'd heard about this, but it's the idea of having a separate property tax rates for residential properties in a district versus businesses. So the residential properties would pay their portion of their property tax to the local district, right, which would then go into how the district administers public education in that district. And the businesses would pay their portion, which would likely be higher, to the state of Texas. And then the state of Texas would look to see how they could distribute that money. The idea of that is to kind of push more of the burden of paying for education onto the state, rather than saying that it'll have to be residential property owners who pay for the bulk of public education in Texas. And I mean, ideally, obviously this is not maybe practically true, but ideally the idea is it would be to the benefit of businesses if education all over the state of Texas improves, because their employees are likely to come not just from from 2 blocks down, but if it's a larger business, to come from all over the state of Texas. She also mentioned that her lifetime goal, because she spent, she's not very old, she's probably in her 30s, but she said that her lifetime goal is to incorporate an inflation adjustment factor into the way that the allocation formula works for state funding for public education, to make sure that, as costs increase and as prices increase, that we're continuing to devote the proper resources to education for students. So I'm back to the slide. And this was something that we kind of talked about, that you can't let people starve to death while you're trying to fix the food systems, that maybe there are some ways to have more short-term solutions while still trying to improve the educational system as a whole, the public education system as a whole, because naturally, again, the majority of students in America go to public schools, but in the interim, that the students who need help the most could maybe get help through charter schools or private schools, or however they choose to. So these are kind of the questions that I have. I'm kind of curious. I've been talking for a bit, but I'm kind of curious as to if you guys have questions, if you have thoughts, because I think this is really something that's more conducive to a discussion than me just talking to one horse. So.
I can say something.
Sure.
So the first question, which investment will produce better student outcomes, public or charter schools? I've thought about this a lot. I don't have too many details and facts to research to back me up. But I would say it's complicated. We talked a lot in ICE about what was it called, Dream Academy in New York, where the students had phenomenal success because they did not have as much oversight. They could do a lot and really tailor it towards the students. I know, who is it? Shaquille O'Neal has a school out in Michigan, which is phenomenal for the students as well. But the thing is, not all charter schools are like this, right? A lot of charter schools might take the money and then not do anything and fail the students. But additionally, there's a lot of public schools that are taking the money and then failing the students. So I wonder if it's a question of really investment in terms of just money, or in terms of investing human resources, time, training teachers, making sure they stick around, because there is a program where if you graduate with a teaching degree and then you go teach in a, Title I, Title V school for 5 years, they take away your student loans and all that. And it's a really great program. But then you have a bunch of new teachers who don't have experience coming in and then just leaving and abandoning these students. And so I really think it's a combination of a lot of stuff. I think we just have to invest in the students. So that's the biggest thing.
I agree. So you mentioned the teachers, right? So part of this is that, we want teachers to go to public schools, right? Like, we want them to go where they're needed the most, but they're also, one, more likely, and this is just kind of true, it's just kind of fact, and it's uncomfortable, but they're more likely just to get discouraged after a couple of years, right? There's so many people who go into schools that feel really idealistic about, why they're doing it, and I want to help the kids, but it's not something that's really, you don't necessarily see those outcomes that you want immediately, and it's very easy to get discouraged, right? But then we also don't pay them enough to want to stick around, right? That if they could go to a school district that has a really high property tax rate and could then pay them a lot more too, or that they could feel more like, yes, I'm actually having that impact on a day-to-day, that they're going to leave, right? Or they're going to go to a charter school where they can be compensated based on how well they're performing, how well they're doing for their students. That I really like the idea that you mentioned, or I'm sure that's been implemented somewhere, of doing something with student loans, right? Because that's something that's, I'm sure, weighing on a lot of people, to find creative ways like that. So.
Yeah, and another thing is that, speaking of HISD in particular, the elementary schools in the HISD tend to be fairly on par with their counterparts in CFISD or Pearland, which are very, very good school districts. But then as you move up into middle school and high school, the educational disparities grow even larger for students. So most of the failing schools in HIC are high schools. So whenever you move in these teachers into these high schools, the students are years behind already. And so it's how do you catch a student up 12 grade levels or 4 grade levels in one school year? And then they're still being graded, their expectation is to reach 12th grade English. And it does not take into account even if they moved up 3 grade levels. And additionally, a lot of these students that are or teachers that are coming in, they're not from the communities. So they don't understand the struggles, and they don't understand how much impact they can actually have on these students, which is just a couple other things to take into account.
This is something that you mentioned about teachers, right? That there's people kind of coming into the community who aren't from the community. And I think this is something that I'd seen as sort of people who are against charter schools, of this idea of, we talked about Harlem Success Academy, that's from ICE, and that you had kind of these affluent people who were coming into these sort of lower income communities and didn't look like the people who lived in these communities, and kind of creating schools almost from this sort of savior complex sort of way. And I mean, it's definitely something that has to be taken into consideration in the way that people choose to open up these schools. But yeah, it's interesting.
Shailee, I wonder if you, oh, sorry. I think I interrupted somebody. Well, I just want to say, I don't know if you came across this in your research, but one of the arguments or questions with school choice that I've always found really interesting is specifically with voucher programs, the idea that you're giving the money to the student rather than to the school or the district. So the money follows the student wherever they go. In other words, with a voucher given to a student or a family and they choose where to go, they're going to go and use it, and the money's going to follow where the best outcome is. I wonder if you encountered that in your research, what you think about that, what others think about it, giving money to the students and the families rather than to schools, as kind of an alternative concept, which is very controversial.
I think I don't think I've actually come across that, but I think it's interesting because you kind of have, right, like the top down of if you give the money to the schools and then they invest in their students versus you let the student take the money and then go where they see fit. I just, part of why I think school vouchers is so controversial, like you said, is that it really only benefits like like a small minority of students, compared to, all the students out there who maybe would like to go to a private school for free if the state would send them. But it's not a very big program, and it's kind of like, should it be a very big program, right? Because the bigger the program, the more money that's then invested into school vouchers that then could go to all of the people who are still in public schools who don't have the opportunity to take that money and go. When I was talking to Miss Villanueva, she was very, I think, adamant that school vouchers are just not the way forward, which I thought was interesting because she was saying that like the vast majority of the time, it's not full tuition, right? It's like just enough. It's kind of partial tuition where you think, oh, maybe I could then afford it. But they're not required to do anything like provide transportation, right? They aren't required to do, if there's a student who gets that voucher who requires like disability accommodations, they're not required to have certified teachers to then provide that service that they need. So I don't think it's like a catch-all sort of thing, but I could see how in this sort of temporary in the interim, in the short term, how if it could benefit a few students to go to a private school, because I mean, there are statistics out there that say that their student outcomes do go up. If they go to a private school, you see this kind of, parents are happier with the way that their child's academics are looking, with the way that the discipline record looks, like that sort of thing. So there's definitely benefits to having it. And if it can, improve the achievement goals of a few students, then why not?
I guess I can go. Y'all can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I found it pretty interesting because I went to a Catholic school for about 4 years, and so that was pretty interesting, pretty different. And then I went to like public school for basically all the rest of my years in school. Another thing that I found pretty interesting about it was I feel like a lot of the language surrounding like the discussion often paints like school choice as kind of like a small government versus big government issue. But one thing that I found was really interesting is the public schools are actually smaller government, if we're being honest, because it's local government that is running that as opposed to state charters. So you have your local community versus your, the state who, they might know what's good for the entire state, but they might not know what's good for your like local community, basically. So that's just some stuff I found interesting. And then another thing, kind of going off of my first point, is like I was just really curious about how like kind of religious schools like kind of stack up, just because I've had personal experience with that.
I guess I'm curious as to your experience. I haven't been to I know people that went to obviously private schools like St. Agnes or I think there's Straight Jesuit, especially in Houston, and have been very happy there and have then gone on to these great colleges and that sort of thing. But yeah, no, I'm curious. You went to a Catholic school. Did you feel like, there was a difference in, I don't know, when you have a place that gives you not just academic instruction, but I guess also religious or moral instruction, that do you feel like it interferes or it didn't really do that?
Yeah, so I went to a school called True Cross in Dickinson that has about 200 students, grades like pre-K through 8th grade. And so like all the classes were really small. There was probably like 16 people in like my class, and we were the biggest class. And again, I don't think this is necessarily representative of all kind of things, because like Straight Jesuit and like St. Agnes, I know are like way bigger than what I'm talking about. But probably the biggest thing that like kind of stuck with me from that is it ruined how I socialized for probably the next 2 years when I got to high school, because there was just not that many people. I had like a very like small group that I interacted with, and that was about it. And so when I went to high school and I knew like nobody, and there was like more people in one room than there was in my entire school, I was like really kind of like, I don't know what's going on here. This is kind of crazy. And so for like 2 years, I like had to learn how to like re-socialize, and that was a fun experience.
Do you feel like there's something to be said for, I guess, just like the diversity that comes from being in a public school versus like, I don't know, in a Catholic school? I don't know how diverse your Catholic school was, but just diversity and, I mean, ethnic diversity, diversity of perspective. Yeah.
Definitely the diversity of perspective, because another I don't know if this is, I think maybe my class was just really weird in Catholic school, but the few people that I've like managed to like stay in contact with also experienced like really similar issues, or like went through like really bad spots like after leaving. Not all of them, because some of them went on to like Catholic high schools and like they knew people there. But like a lot of the people who went to like public high schools were kind of like, yeah, like this isn't it. Like I went through like a really rough spot for those first few years. So I think the diversity of opinion, we were actually a decently diverse group, like kind of like culturally, but like definitely in terms of perspective. And that's also something interesting too, because like I think in our class, like at the time we were all pretty much believing kind of the same thing about stuff, but our everyone's like views have kind of like shifted really drastically, like since then, probably because like we entered high school, and I feel like that's where like you really start to form like really hard like opinions about stuff. But yeah.
I think when I was talking to Miss Villanueva, because she's very progressive. She's very pro public schools. Like she's anti charter schools, anti school vouchers. Just kind of believes that the way forward is in just investing more in public education. And I think part of that, and what's interesting is she kind of talked about herself as this, that she's fiscally conservative, because she was saying that it's just not cost effective to be running charter schools at the same time as you're running public schools, right? Because you just have these parallel school districts and you're dumping money into both of them, where it's like, why not just focus your energies on one, which I thought was interesting, because I hadn't really, you kind of think of education, that if anybody wants to invest in education, you don't really associate them as fiscally conservative. But she was saying that if you kind of take the emotions out of it a little bit, that it's not cost effective to have charter schools.
Do you think public schools should be ran more like charter schools?
See, like this is where the problem comes, right? Because charter schools, I think by definition, are successful in that they're doing something different from public schools, because they don't have that accountability, right? But if we had public schools run like charter schools, where they don't have that school board, where there's nobody there to kind of regulate, are students being taught according to the curriculum, are certain schools doing better than other schools? How can, like, if you don't have anybody there to kind of monitor, this is where like 95% of America's school children go. And if every school is trying something new, like a charter school, you just never would have any sort of standardized education across the board.
I'll also add to that. Sorry.
Sure, yeah, go.
So I come from a military family. Both my parents were in the Navy. And then after they got out, we still kept moving around like a military family. So I went to over 15 elementary schools, 4 or 5 middle schools, and then 2 high schools. And I will say no school already is ran the same. So it's very difficult in terms of each teacher kind of has control over their own classroom. So how they teach. each state and then to some extent each school teaches in a different order. So I did not learn what a dwarf planet was until 8th grade, just because I always missed the solar systems unit. And so already there's a problems there. But then if you add in an additional lack of oversight, it becomes even more difficult, because one of the things that this regulation that the state and being a public school provides, for like one aspect, let's talk about like race, right? In Texas specifically, there's been a lot of discrimination issues. And for the longest time for voting, like for redistricting and in terms of education, Texas was monitored by the federal government to make sure that they weren't discriminating too much and being too racist. This only ended in like 2014, I believe. So like this current redistricting is really interesting. But these charter schools don't have this type of oversight, right? And so oftentimes students can be left behind. They can be discriminated against. The school can be all white, like public or private schools specifically. A lot of the ones in the South were formed because of in response to freeing slaves and then the civil rights movement. And so when you lose that, like sometimes it's fine. So like Harmony schools and yes, prep schools are known to be very good charter schools. But for these smaller independent ones, it really does a disservice to students. And already the oversight level for public schools is not as high as you would think.
I think I agree. It kind of comes down to like the minority of students, right? Like the people who, you mentioned people of color, but also again, people with disabilities, right? That charter schools would have to take these students, but they don't necessarily need to meet their needs, right?
Because actually, my friend's with me. She was just telling me how for students with disabilities, it was what year? It was like, I think it was like in 2018, the state of Texas came out and said, hi, by the way, we actually don't have the facilities to educate students with disabilities. And we haven't for like 20 years. And that was just completely missed. There's been states or there's been school districts who have put like a cap on students with disabilities that they will serve. And so even if you need that extra support, they won't give it to you.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So doesn't that, okay, we'll be here. Doesn't that, like, this issue is like with charter schools as a long-term solution, right? Like as you like bring up all these different problems, but like, is your point not that charter schools should be like a short-term type of thing? Because like, I understand that you can have, I guess, a lot of different like problems with it in the long term, but in the short term, it's meant to be like a testing thing, right? Like you have charter schools, you figure out what works, and then you implement that in public schools, which I feel like we haven't like talked about too much, but like, is it feasible to implement the changes in public schools? Is that something that we can make happen? Or is it just like, we just have to do short-term solutions forever? Like, how does that work?
Is it even right to have like kids in charter schools be testing subjects? Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Someone has to be.
Yeah, right. And I mean, they also like, a lot of parents want their kid to go, especially if a charter school is shown that, in places like in New York where they have Harlem Success Academy, where they've shown that the students there have consistently improved beyond what the local public school has, that parents will willingly send their kids there, right? But I guess to your point about whether we can implement these into public schools. So I mentioned Terry Greer. So he was the superintendent of HISD between 2009 and 2016. And he kind of did basically that. So when Rod Page was superintendent, right, he opened the 20 charter schools. And when Terry Greer came in, basically what he said was, what if we were to take 20 of the lowest performing schools in HISD and implement some of the strategies and tactics used in the highest performing charter schools in the country? And so they did. And, student success outcomes increased. So I think it is possible to take what works in different charter schools and be able to implement it into kind of different schools in a public school setting. But I think what made his work unique was that to be able to do that, to be able to take those, take that Apollo 20 program is what he called it, he had to raise something like $16 million, and he did it privately. Like, it wasn't like he got extra funding from the state of Texas to be able to carry out this project. it just requires a lot of money and investment to make our schools more effective, which is kind of common sense, but like Texas already doesn't want to give you more money. And then when you want to change things and you want to reform, you have to find different ways to get that money.
I'd also like to ask in terms of that question, is it possible that if you have a charter school in an area for like that short-term effect of testing if these things are feasible, that would have a long-term impact on the school system, right? And this is kind of also going to your question about priority, because schools are the center of a community. Oftentimes they provide other resources and all that. And so we've seen in the past, like the 60s with communities of color, they've intentionally defunded the schools. Here in the Third Ward specifically, UH even destroyed Yates's football stadium, which is like a big thing, which really hurt the community. And Yates used to be a really big, like successful school. And now I think they have like 32 people in their graduating class. And it's been like a degradation of the community. And so as we were talking earlier about vouchers, that is the student kind of taking that money, right? So as these students move away from their community school into these other schools of choice, they're kind of taking money with them. And maybe that's temporary. Maybe they are just testing it and maybe they want to come back. But as they leave, the money leaves. And then the teachers leave following the money. And then the programs leave because there's no one to teach them. And then it just leads to the downfall of the community in a way that they really can't bring back, which then leads to schools closing. So is it even worth it to test in terms of charter schools?
So the charters generally go for about 5 years, right? So it seems like, okay, that's like a relatively short period of time in which they can try a couple different things and see what works, right? But what I was talking to Ms. Villanueva about this, and what she said was also that kind of what you're saying, that a lot of school districts are planning already 5-10 years in advance, right? They have projections based on just census data of the amount of students that they're going to have in their schools. And then based on that, they make financial and practical decisions about, do we need to open new schools? Do we need to invest more in different areas, right? But if suddenly a charter pops up and they start taking students away from the public school, then, you know, how does that school district manage its projections? How does it then decide, okay, how many students are going to stay at the charter school? How much do we need? Is the charter school going to remain? Will they renew their charter in 5 years? Will they be here another 10, 15 years? I think that's part of HISD opened 20 charter schools, but I don't know the answer to this, but I'm curious to know if it was more effective to open the 20 charter schools, or if it was more effective to retrofit those 20 low performing schools with the strategies of the high performing charter schools. And if that was maybe a better option, like you said, to kind of the schools that are already in the community and already have that sort of value there, rather than introducing new ones that could just be there for a temporary trial period.
It's also like, I'm going to play devil's advocate for myself, but it's also like, we know, or from the documentary that we watched in ICE, but like, we know how good education works, right? Like, we've done research and the information is there, it's just not being implemented. So it seems like it would be more effective to try to implement it, but like with unions and everything, the charter schools is just like what you fall back on, right? Because they won't let you implement it, which is like a whole other problem.
I kind of feel, go ahead.
No, please.
Confused on how this would, like, taking the curriculum or techniques used in high performing charter schools and putting them into the low performing, say, public schools, just because the community issues, things like that, might be so diverse in the first place. Like, I don't know how they actually made that work, because a while back, I think when we were doing peers, we have this thing called project-based learning, right? And this is used in high performing schools to learn through projects. And my friend who's in teacher, Houston, who was one of the curriculum writers, was like, there's a reason why we can't, like, these aren't placed in like low performing schools or in schools with like these type of issues, because these kids still are kind of even learning just the basic information, and there's just so many issues in like that sense that we can't just go in and suddenly like put PBL there.
See, right, like this is, I think, the thing that frustrates me, I think, more than anything else, is the idea of, okay, if we can't make long-term lasting change on a large scale, that, okay, maybe you can do something short-term, right? Maybe you can do stuff like charter schools or bring in better teachers or, you know, things that are smaller and more feasible. But even when you introduce those new changes, you still hit this just like massive problem of, if you don't have the same levels of education delivered from like the age of 5, right? That it really starts in like first and second grade. And if, you know, kids aren't getting that same sort of level of instruction in the schools then, and they don't meet those sort of base standards of learning to read and getting those necessary skills at the beginning, it just compounds every year. So it's like, okay, let's, you know, HISD has this one failing high school, let's bring in new teachers, let's bring in new strategies. But the change would have to start with the elementary schools, right? Because you can't, those students at that point, there's only so much you can do because they haven't gotten the foundation, but you also can't write them off, right? Because they also deserve to be able to go into society as working productive members. So I'm with you. I don't.
Now, there was a school that I used to work at called Worthing High School, and I just shared the article because afterwards they were apparently about to be closed down. And like it was the exact same scenario that you described. Like their scores, they're like right near us, like right across like Kip in the Sunnyside. They're like right there. And so when I worked there, it was really hard. It was like, you know, constantly like the kids were getting into fight, the teachers were exhausted. Like you could not blame those teachers for wanting to leave such a situation because every day was a battle. And I don't even know like what kind of like teacher or resilience or like what would even solve that, because I mean, maybe I don't want to say that the school should be closed down. I mean, they are really like a nice school and there's so many kids that they're serving, but and those kids I think would have been dispersed to other schools. Like there was a lot of students there who were like Spanish speakers, like they couldn't speak like English at all, so they were like literally just copying their assignments from online, and they're in high school and they had to take all these STAR exams, and I was just like, I don't know what to tell you. So it's a really strange situation, I think, here in Houston.
I'd like to add on to that a bit in terms of schools closing, moving to charter schools, moving to all this stuff, and just all that type of thing. We're kind of seeing it now with COVID, as in moving on to virtual learning and then back in person. Moving schools and moving formats is very detrimental to students in terms of you're losing information and time because they're having to get used to a whole new system. It's traumatic oftentimes. And then you just lose track of students entirely. There's a lot of students in HISD currently who they have just not heard from in like 4 months. They have no idea where in the system they are. Some have like moved back to Mexico. Some have they have no internet access at home. And so they do like wellness checks and it's just nothing. But moving around like that can be very traumatic to students, especially if they have special needs in terms of like they need to their English as a second language students, or they need extra support in math, especially if they no longer have the teachers that know how to accommodate them. It's just very bad for students. And so this is not like pro charter school, pro public, but it's how do we prevent having all these traumatic experiences to students while providing the best support for them.
Well, I think this is very, very fun. It was a fun way to spend my evening. And I wanted to, I guess, thank you guys for participating and discussing, because that was a great time. But yeah, it's 7 o'clock. So thanks for joining me for the hour. I appreciate it.